Smitty's Tenderloin. Met with a group of guys over there, and I apologize for being late, but your ethanol industry is alive and well because I sat behind about 100-car ethanol train on my way to get here. And so eventually we doubled back and went all the way around. But sorry about that. 2 minutes.
You just stand in front of it, it'll catch your voice.
Okay. That is better, thanks. First off, thank you all. Thank you for signing on to Patriot Voices and your willingness to go around the state with me. And as you know, we're sort of in the process right now of doing what 16 or 17 other people in the country are doing. It seems like more, but we're out there and talking to folks and talking about a message and what we're going to do to try to get this country back and rolling again. It seems like old home week for me. I love coming back here to Iowa. I had an amazing experience and see a lot of familiar faces here and friends who were helpful last time. And we're thinking very hard about whether to go again, because when I look at the situation, as we all expected, we said this was the most important election in the history of our country back in 2012. It turned out to be the case. Things have gotten a lot more difficult, particularly internationally. I always remind people there were 23 debates last time, and 22 of them were on domestic policy, one on national security. And all the other 22 debates, there was maybe one question per debate, if that. That's not going to be the case this time around. National security is an important issue, and unlike every other issue, as you all know, because in the legislature you know that when it comes to any domestic policy, the president, unless he's doing what this president does, which is abuse the Constitution, but the president has limited ability without getting the Congress to go along. On national security, unfortunately, we've seen how powerful a president can be in transforming the country and our image around the world and the mess that has been created. I always said there's only 2 countries in the United States that has a better relationship now than we did 8 years ago, and that's Cuba and Iran. And both those countries are doing horrible, horrible things in their region of the world. We all know a lot about what Iran is doing, developing a nuclear weapon. This is a theocracy whose goal is to bring about the end of times. If you study their theology, that is the goal of their theology, is to bring about the return of the 12th Imam, which is at the end of times and a time of great war, global war. That's their theology, and we are on a path to give them a weapon that can bring that about. That is unlike any other country that has a nuclear weapon. So when you hear, probably particularly you hear the left in Washington say, well, we can't let Iran get a nuclear weapon. There's a reason they say that. They don't discuss it publicly with you. But the reason is they know this is a different country. This is a country run as a theocracy that is not concerned about their own well-being. They believe the fact that they're willing to sacrifice their own well-being for some larger theological goal. And that's why Israel, everyone points to Netanyahu. You talk to any political party in Israel, any of these non-Arab parties, and they will tell you the same thing. There is uniformity. There is nothing. There is zero between any of the parties on Iran. And yet we have a president who's going to do this. I raise that because I'm someone who actually has been studying Iran, has been working and fighting Iran. I don't know if you saw this just the other day. I was listed in the ISIS magazine as one of the enemies in their publication. I've been studying radical Islam since right after 9/11. I called out President Bush on not identifying the enemy, radical Islam. I've called him out on negotiating with Iran when President Bush did it. I pushed sanctions bills. I authored sanctions bill. I passed sanctions bills. This has been a singular focus of mine, and I feel like there are very few who are recognized over there as well as here who understand this issue as well and are prepared to do something that's going to keep us safe, which this president is not doing right now. A couple other things I'll just cover. On the domestic policy side, I don't think I have to sit here and brandish my conservative credentials. I think everybody's familiar with that. I would like to say that the message I tried to deliver 4 years ago focused a lot on manufacturing. I introduced a manufacturing plant down in Burlington and Wyandotte, and talked about how we have to revitalize that section of the economy because the whole middle of America was beginning to hollow out. And now you hear this talked about now on both sides, that middle America is not doing well. Median income in this country was at $56,000 a year in 2008. It's $51,000 today. Wages have stagnated. Workers are feeling like neither party really gets them. The last election, we didn't do a very good job in the presidential election of identifying with workers. 90% of Americans who work don't own their own business or run a business. They work for a business. Or they work for some other entity. We have to be the party that identifies with the folks who are falling behind, with the folks who are not the business owners, but the workers for the business, and have an agenda that says, we're going to provide a better opportunity for you to rise in America. And it starts, in my opinion, with making us competitive on manufacturing. It starts with making us an energy independent country that is vibrant, as we've seen what energy has done here to the Iowa economy. It can do so to the, tomorrow I'm speaking to a clean coal conference here. It can do so in other areas of America. And low-cost energy helps consumers more than anything else we can do for them. You saw President Obama's numbers go up in the last 6 months. One reason, gas prices went down. Was the one reason they went up. Why? Because lower-income Americans spend 40 to 50% of their disposable income on energy. And so low-cost energy is good for our economy, it's good for lower-income people, and it's good to attract manufacturing jobs, which even spurs our economy some more. So the final thing is construction. I'm someone who believes that we need to cut the federal gas tax dramatically. We need to let states have control of the projects outside of the major interstates that go through the state. The federal government should be out of the transportation business. We have no business. We increase the cost of transportation projects by having all these, anything with federal dollars go through and get permitted from the federal level. We need to give this back to where it belongs with the state and local level and put more resources in. We can do it if we cut the taxes and limit those tax dollars to projects of major economic infrastructure and transportation projects. Finally, the one big issue, you know, last time around I was sort of known as the social conservative candidate. I think those of you who got to know me know that we have a pretty strong record on a whole lot of issues. The one social conservative issue that I think is two of them, I should say, are paramount right now. Number one, the one that's been in the news recently, which is religious liberty. I know you've all, as state legislators, have seen what happened in Indiana and Arkansas. What happened there was the media created a firestorm and leaders didn't lead. I've been through that firestorm. I can go back 13 years when I was in the United States Senate and stood up and said, if the Supreme Court decides a case this way, then all these bad things are going to start happening. And I said we would have same-sex marriage in this country in 10 years. I was wrong. It was 5 years. And I was put through a national ringer like no one had been put through, and I have been put through over and over and over again. Because I'm not going to back down from what I believe is the right course for our country. And you learn that the media can be brutal, it can be intimidating, it can be overwhelming. And you can look at folks and you can think, wow, that's a stand-up person, they're going to stand up tall, they're not going to back down when it gets tough. And then you realize, wow, that's not what I thought was going to happen. I just share that with you, is there's nothing that, and this is what Walt was talking about, there's nothing that substitutes for experience, and particularly experience being in the middle of a vortex of a firestorm when your conservative principles and ideas are under the most intense scrutiny, and where you're being called everything you can possibly imagine and trying to be intimidated into backing away from your positions. That's when you find out whether the person really has what is necessary to stand up and lead through a difficult time. Not back down, not run for the hills, not bail out, but actually stand up and in a positive and hopefully winsome way make the arguments. I always say, when it comes to whether it's religious liberty now, or the marriage issue, or a whole bunch of other things, we're losing these arguments simply because we're not making them. And we're not making them because we're intimidated from making them. And I think that's just if that continues, then life as we know it, particularly the family, is going to be on a very, very bad track for the long term. So I just want to share with you that if you're looking for someone who's gone through that experience, they just did a scorecard of folks who responded to the Indiana crisis, and we scored an A+. Let me show you that everybody else did on that list, the comments they made, and in fighting for the truth, not the perversion that we saw the media try to ram down the American public's throat about what Indiana and Arkansas were doing. And finally, this also goes with the issue of Common Core, which I know is a very big issue here in Iowa. It's one that's very important to me. I wrote a book called Blue Collar Conservative, and I talked about the importance of education. There have just been 2 books published, which I talk about all the time. One from a guy from the far left by the name of Robert Putnam, who wrote a book called Our Kids. He's a Harvard sociologist, a liberal. The other written a few years ago by a guy named Charles Murray, who's a libertarian, writes for the American Enterprise Institute. And those 2 books come to the same conclusion, that the principal problem of the hollowing out of America, the principal problem of children not achieving, the principal problem of us not being able to rise as we had the opportunity in the past, centers around primarily the breakdown of the American family. And these are things I was talking about, as you know, talking about the American family is the basic small business. It's the first economic unit. And it's fractured. And as a result, what we're seeing is the left and the right coming together and saying, we don't know what to do about it. They both basically concede that. But they realize that, and this is Putnam's saying, he said, you know, if you come from a 2-parent family, from a neighborhood of 2-parent families, and you go to the schools in that community where most 2-parent family kids go, the chances of you succeeding are incredibly high in America, and it doesn't matter whether you're race, color, or creed. They're the same. Let me repeat that. They're the same. There's no racial differentiation if you come from that neighborhood. Conversely, if you come from a single-parent family in a neighborhood of single-parent families, that's important. So you can be in a single-parent family in a neighborhood where there's a mix, but if you come from a single-parent family in a neighborhood of single-parent families, and the school is single-parent families, the chance, according to Putnam, the chance that you will rise to the top 20% of income earners, which is not the top 1%, top 20% is 3%. Now, I don't know about you, but that's something, if I'm a Republican, if I'm a conservative, if I'm an American, that's not good enough. That's just not good enough. And we have to say, we need to do something about that. And if it means stepping on some eggshells and saying, you know what, we need to start talking about the family. We need to start talking about what government is doing to hurt the family, what it's doing to help the family, what we can do as a community at large to try to help reinvigorate this vitally important thing for our children. Finally, education. I said, you know, we don't need Common Core. I don't know of any teacher in America who thinks that the reason we have dropout rates of 50% in our worst schools is because of education standards. Education standard is not the problem in these schools that are failing. The problem is that we don't have parents engaged in the education enterprise in their homes and in schools. I'm as tough on public education as anybody, but I'm sick and tired of the scapegoating of teachers and administrators like it's their problem, they're the only reasons things are failing. That's not true. We all have to take and shoulder that responsibility. And we need to have an honest discussion about a revolution in education. And the last thing we need is elites in our culture telling us what should be taught in our schools. What we need are parents to be fully engaged in that enterprise. And every aspect. And begin to not just engage them, but talk about the importance of them for their children's future and America's future. All of these things, you know, I talk a lot about issues, as you hear, a lot of them are not issues that are going to be solved on the federal level. Most of the issues on family, education, these are your ballgames. Transportation. So I share that with you that, you know, these are national issues, but where that's going to happen is right here. And the opportunities for you to have a real impact. I mean, the most profound impact that we're going to have on fixing the family is going to happen here, not in Washington, D.C. We can talk about it, but there are very few things we can legislate that are going to make a huge difference. Things that you can do here in your community and the state are going to have a much bigger impact. I'll stop and be happy to take whatever questions you folks have.
Come on, those questions.
Senator, could you comment on the federal budget deficit and what you would do with your first budget to address that?
The two biggest things you can do in dealing with the federal budget is, number one, grow the economy. Create a pro-growth economic platform that's going to increase revenues because you have more work, more people working, more people paying taxes, businesses succeeding paying taxes. So higher growth means more revenue. Second, in conjunction with that, you'll have lower outlays. You saw that our budget deficit went way down, and we did virtually nothing. I mean, you talk about the sequester, but the sequester was pennies compared to the amount of deficit reduction, and it was all because entitlement payments went down. We were up to somewhere close to 50% of Americans receiving some sort of government benefit. It's now back to 40. And if the historical norm prior to the 2008 recession was actually 31, 32%. So we're not back to historical norms, and that is primarily because of President Obama expanding welfare programs. So growth helps both spending and revenues. So that's the primary focus. Second is entitlement. If you look at the federal budget, you know, the area of growth over the past 30 years is all on the entitlement side. Has there been some growth under Obama on discretionary spending? Sure there was. There's a lot of growth. That has flattened out thanks to a Republican Congress, and we need to continue to decrease it. But ladies and gentlemen, that's not where the growth in the government is. The growth in the government is in Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, and other types of welfare and entitlement programs. And so you're looking at the guy who was responsible as the floor leader for the 96 welfare bill. And we did something in the 96 welfare bill that I believe is essential, and you can do it here. I think you can probably get a waiver to do it here. And that is in TANF, when we got rid of AFDC and replaced it with TANF, we fought for two things. The Bill Clinton vetoed the bill twice, but we never compromised on these two things. It was at the heart of the bill that I helped put together, and I was not going to compromise in negotiations. And so I compromised on daycare, I compromised on transportation, I compromised on lots of things. Because I knew that if I got these two things, those numbers would all be less than what was projected. Why? Because there'd be a lot less people on the rolls. And that actually happened. And the two things we required: work, two, time limits. Welfare is temporary, and you have to work in order to participate in it. And I just saw an article, I don't know if you may have seen it, in Maine. They passed a bill for their SNAP program that requires work for able-bodied, single men and women, not parents with dependents, but for able-bodied, single. They had 12,000 people on their SNAP program. They implemented that. They're down to 2,500. Right? So you get a real case right away as to how many people really need this and how many people are in fact receiving benefits that maybe they'd be better off if they went out and worked and found a job and were able to receive it. So we're talking about not people who are working poor who need SNAP. We're talking about people who weren't working who are getting SNAP. That's the difference. I mean, I think we all are saying if you're working and you're trying and you need some help with food assistance, fine. If you're not working and you're able-bodied, then we have an issue. I think that's appropriate, not just for SNAP, but for all of the entitlement programs out there. All entitlement programs should be in the same kind of the same cloth as TANF. Temporary and a path forward, right? Temporary and a path forward, and that means work or vocational training or something that gives you the ability to transition off those programs. So that's not being heartless, that's helping people with a handout. Oh, I'm sorry.
You just talking about entitlement programs here, and one of the things you mentioned was Social Security. I've been paying into the Social Security system since I was 14 years old. And I've given the federal government a number of dollars in my time. I'm 72 now. The last few years here that I've been drawing Social Security, I still send in Social Security payments. And they send me back an additional $5 a month, or whatever the case might be. Very poor program for someone that wants to continue to work after you start drawing Social Security. So I don't feel I'm any part of an entitlement program.
Okay, I would say that you're right. You're an entitlement program only because the program is set up as an entitlement. If you qualify, you get the benefits. That's what an entitlement program is. You qualify by having worked and paid into it. Other people qualify for other entitlements because of financial condition, disability. So there's all different kinds of entitlement. I always say that Social Security is an earned entitlement, as opposed to the other ones usually are not earned entitlements. But still, they are what they are. The issue with Social Security is that a few years ago, and then again in a couple of years from now, Social Security is going to be paying out more in benefits than it's going to be receiving in income. Back in, I think it was 2009, 2010, 11, something like that, Social Security ran a deficit for a while. We were at the depths of the high unemployment rates. And as unemployment picked up and people started paying more Social Security benefits, that leveled out. But with the boomers continuing to hit retirement age, people living longer, and the baby bust, being in the workforce, we're having fewer and fewer people paying, more and more people retiring. And so we're going to reach a point where Social Security, instead of covering the deficit, making it look not as bad as it really is now going to start exacerbating the deficit. And so we have to come up with, and there are, because people ask me this all the time, well, aren't there trust funds there to pay Social Security? Yes, but the trust funds are just what you would expect. They're treasury bonds. Now, what's a treasury bond? What's an obligation of the government? So, in a sense, yeah, there are trust funds there, but it's simply an obligation from this part of the government, the general fund, to pay this part of the government, which is the treasury. So, all you can do is issue another bond and pay this bond. And that's really the only way it can work. Some of us wanted to actually have these dollars invested by individuals, have their own accounts, but that ship has sailed, and that's not going to happen. So the question is, how do we fix the problem? And the only way I see that we can fix the problem is to adjust the Social Security system to fit the reality of the workforce and the health of the nation, and the health and life expectancy of Social Security recipients. I don't know when you start, well, you start paying it 50-some years ago, but when Social Security was established in 1936, life expectancy was 61. Today it's 80. For women, 82. If you hit 62, you're eligible for Social Security benefits at 62. That's never changed. So you're eligible for Social Security. 75% of Americans take Social Security at age 62. And if you take Social Security at age 62, your life expectancy at 62 is, I think, 85 or 86. So you're going to spend 23 or 24 years on average on Social Security. No one, when they designed the system, anticipated Social Security would be a system where people would be on it for 25 years. And it was not designed to do that. And so that's the reason we've gone from when just a few years before I was born, Social Security tax was 2% of the first $3,000 you earned. And now it's 12.5% or 12.6% of the first $120,000 you earned. Why? Because of demographics. people living longer, fewer workers to pay. So we can continue to say, well, we're not going to change the benefit structure and just charge the next generation more money. Or we can say, Social Security was not designed for people to live 25 years on. And we did that. This very unpopular, horrible president changed the Social Security system to increase the eligibility age from 65 to 67. You know who that was? Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, in 1982, with Tip O'Neill, phased the Social Security. Nobody knows that. Why? Because he was really smart and didn't do it until he was dead, right? He didn't start phasing out for 20 years. And all the politicians who did it were gone. Nobody got voted out of office because of it. It was brilliant. Well, we have to look at it and say, we stopped at 67, and by the way, we left the early retirement age, early eligibility age at 62. And so what I'm saying is that going forward, I'm 56, I think my full eligibility age is like 66 and 10 months, and then people born a few years after that, it'll hit 67 and then stops. It doesn't go back any further. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't continue to move that eligibility age back. People are continuing to live longer, and move the 62 back. You don't do it overnight. For future retirees, you know, for someone who's, let me see, let's say it's about 10 years, or actually more than that, probably about 15 years before it's fully phased in. So someone who is 50 years old, instead of having early eligibility at 62, it'd be 62 in 1 month. I don't think that's going to make a huge difference in their life. And someone who's 51 is, 49 will be 62 in 2 months. So you do something like that over a period of time, and believe it or not, when you do something like that, you solve not the entire problem, but you solve a big part of the Social Security shortfall by doing that. Now, by the way, you suggest something like this, the ARP and all these groups come out and say, oh, he's going to cut Social Security, he's going to rob grandma, he's going to take your benefits away. It has nothing to do with anybody who's out of your Social Security retirement age. It has to do with future generations and what folks have done in the past, and if we're going to make it viable in the future, it's either do something like that or have dramatic increases in taxes.
I think you can take one more question.
Yeah.
We've got a president that's governing by executive orders. What's your view of that? If you're president, how are you going to reform your use of them?
Well, the first thing, the great thing about the illegal actions of the president, the unconstitutional actions of the president, is he's governing by fiat, and the next president can ungovern it. So everything he does, by order or action or rulemaking or reinterpretation of rule, can be undone day one. And you have my commitment if we decide to run, and if we decide to run, I'm only doing so because I'm deciding to win, then we'll undo all those. Every one of those injurious regulations, every one of those injurious executive orders, we'll undo them or we'll rewrite them in a way that accomplishes what may be necessary to do in interpreting the law, but do it in a way that conforms with congressional intent and is less intrusive. Here's the second thing that's really important. And you folks know this because you're in the legislature. And you've seen, I'm sure some of you at least have looked at parts of the Affordable Care Act. In the Affordable Care Act, the words "secretary shall" appear like 1,000 times. I mean, it's an outrageous number of times, hundreds of times. What is that? Well, you folks know this. If you can't make the tough call, you just say, okay, we'll just leave it for the regulators to figure this out, because you don't want to make the tough call in the legislature. And Congress does this all the time, where we have a complex issue and we say, well, we can't agree on it, so we'll just leave it for the secretary to do. Well, that's just malpractice. And what it does, it creates behemoths of regulations and rules, most of which, certainly under this administration, are contrary to what the original intent of the law is, or simply suspend the law. So, you all, I assume you do this in Iowa, but in the federal government, we have a sunset rule. So, bills that are passed usually for a period of time, and then they come up for review again, and they have to be extended, reauthorized in the Congress. Now, I don't know if you do that here, but that's what happened. So you know the most famous one, which is the Transportation Authorization Bill. It's a 5-year bill, it's a 7-year bill. But we do the same things for most other acts, are authorized for periods of time. And so what a president can do, if you really want to limit the ability of a president in the future, because I can undo what President Obama does, but then President, pick a liberal Democrat who might come in later, can undo what the Republican president does. The only way you can try to fix that is you can get the Congress to start stepping up and doing what they're supposed to do, which is be more precise and actually decide things in their legislation. Don't give authority to the Secretary to make these types of decisions. Make them in the bill. And if you think it's too complicated, then don't regulate in that area. Okay? If you can't do it through the law, then maybe it's best that the government doesn't do it at all and start making some of those calls. So these reauthorizations, which will be coming up periodically, are opportunities for a president to say, I'm not going to sign this vanilla authorization that looks like non-controversial until you tighten up this, and this, and this, and give direction and detail as to what you want the EPA to do in this area, or the FEC to do, or the FCC to do. Those are the kinds of things that make it harder for Congress and make it better for freedom. Am I done?
Well, you have to get going soon.
Okay.
And so you can either take one more question or have a little more time to talk about on your way out.
I'm happy to do either, but whatever everybody wants to do. If you want to meet and greet, I'm happy to do that. And I understand that